So when you're sculpting heads, it's often useful to use hard eyeball shapes known as a blank inside the sculpt rather than actually sculpting it in clay. Now this means that you can place the eyeballs in the position, move them around as required, and you can get perfect placement and then sculpt the eyelids around them using clay without fear of damaging those eyeballs. Whereas if obviously you were to use clay to make the eyeballs, you've got to be careful about how you sculpt the eyelids. So by doing this way, you can then make your mould of the head with these eye forms in place and then bolt those eye forms into the mould, like here, so that they're correctly placed and create an accurate cavity for the proper fake eyes you're going to place in them later each time you run a silicone in this mould. Now, if you are going to insert fake eyes into the finished prop, such as a silicone head or something, which is going to be, hair punched, maybe have fake teeth and a mouth interior and a tongue in there, then you need to make sure that you know that the eyeballs are the correct size. Now, usually that means either making a blank using the correct diameter eyeball blank ahead of time, so that you can start the sculpt before you get the finished eyes back, or you can get the fake eyes made first and then make a mold of those eyes so that you can make a resin copy and then use those as blanks. And adult human eyes will vary in size, but sometimes when you're doing creatures or aliens and other kind of beasties, then that may mean that a standard size eye isn't what you need anyway, so you're still going to have to make something a little bit funky. This is an alien that I sculpted for a commercial years ago, and for example, something like this, I need the curvature of the eyes, but this is a makeup, so this is actually going to fit on top of a head. So I need the curvature of the eye, but I can't get a complete sphere in there because the thing needs to sit under a makeup and there's a person inside that. So I had to make this old school, but this would have been easier to do with a 3D printer because I could just, make one and flip it. But anyway, I digress. In this example, I decided to model up an eye blank in CAD and then print them on a 3D printer. Now, I thought this would be a useful shape to keep, so I also molded this shape and I cast them up in resin. And I basically documented the process to show you how it works. Now, you can get spheres or hemispheres, which are half spheres, from places like model making suppliers, which usually will stock various sizes. And you can try your luck online. You can find like bath bomb molds, ping pong balls. There are DIY Christmas bauble kits or sugarcraft and cake molds, ice cube trays, all that kind of stuff. There's lots of things that could be spherical or hemispherical, but I like to get mine when I was but making them from hemispheres, I tended to get them from model makers because they had accurate sizes that they would list. But because I want to do something a bit more precisely and a bit repeatable, I opted this time to use CAD and 3D print my eyeball blanks. Now, there are a few different ways it could be done. Either a complete sphere or a hemisphere, for example. Most of the eyeball is inside a head, so therefore unseen. So a complete eyeball isn't often needed. You don't need a complete sphere all the time. However, the thing with eyes is that they usually have to look in a certain direction or, in the correct place. And if you have a boz-eye dummy head with one eye off to the chip shop, that can be a bit distracting. So that can undo what would otherwise be a very effective head. So having a complete or almost complete sphere cavity allows you to then put an eyeball sphere or a 3/4 eyeball sphere into it and reposition the eye. You can actually rotate the eye until the eyeballs are looking in the right direction. Then the finished sculpt can then be molded with the eyeball blank in place and made removable. That way, the resulting rubber head prop has a removable eyeball shape, which is the right size, it's in the right place, and it can be popped out to allow the finished eye to be placed in, and you won't have a bulging, ill-fitting eye sat badly in the socket running all over the place. So dodgy looking eyes have undone many a good fake head which would otherwise been perfect. So the placement and position of the eyeball is a huge part of that. Making up the eye shapes in CAD was pretty easy. I opted for a sphere of 26 millimeters in diameter, and I added another sphere within that to create the bulge of the cornea. Now, the exact size of a cornea, and indeed the eyeballs, vary, but most things, it's mostly guided by what looks right. So I made a few variations until I was happy with the look. It's weird, sometimes you CAD stuff up and they look fine on screen, and then when you actually print one and look at it, it doesn't look quite right to the eye. So I did make a few versions until I was happy with it. But it depends on the project. A simple sphere may work just fine, but usually the corneal bulge is a nice thing to have, and it makes the eyelids sit better as well. So I opted for a 3/4 sphere, or just over a 3/4 sphere, as it gives me most of a complete eyeball with a flat back which makes the printing and handling much easier. I printed this using my old Anycubic Photon S and it worked fine, but there were a few little shifts and print lines which needed sanding down carefully. So I did that with some wet and dry paper, and after this I sprayed it with a filler primer and then a gloss lacquer. Now this was both to help it have a smooth finish, but also my thinking was to reduce the chance of my silicone inhibiting on the surface of this. The mold I want to make will use a platinum silicone, and sometimes the resins that we use for printing are able to mess with the silicone setting properly on the surface of that. So hopefully, my hope is that these sprays will prevent that from happening. To make a mold of this, I could have simply just whacked a wall around it using clay, or I could have just used a piece of waste pipe or wastewater pipe or something sort of 50mm diameter. Would have made a perfectly serviceable wall for this mold. But I wanted to make something a bit funky. I fancied over-engineering something, so I 3D printed something that I modelled up, which is basically like a little sort of cup with a little platform in there to hold the eyeball up off the floor. And I flared out the cup like a shot glass to make the silicone out. Now I know I could probably just shopped around and just bought a pre-made plastic shot glass. That would have been fine. I wouldn't have had to do any of this, but I enjoyed making it exactly the right size and shape. I only needed a couple of these, so I decided to do it that way. Once this was made, I also made a 3D printed mold to create a silicone plug to be used when the resin was poured up. Now, this is kind of difficult to explain now, so I'll just wait until later in the video so you'll see what I mean. So to mold this eye form, I tacked the eyeball form onto this little post using just a tiny drop of super glue. Once that had set, I sprayed the mold and the eyeball with a release agent. I'm using here an epoxy par film, and I mixed up my silicone. Now I wanted a softish silicone to make it easier to flex and squeeze the mold to get the eyeball shapes out. So I opted to use a little of what I had left, which was 7315 by Polytech. It's a nice runny silicone, has a decent working time, and it has a sure rate of 15, hence the 15 in 7315. After this was left for several hours to cure, I opened up the mould, and this involved carefully prising it out using a screwdriver to release the silicone from the sides of my 3D printed mould and to encourage it out. Now, it was for this reason I wanted sloping sides rather than a parallel side that would happen had I just used a piece of plastic pipe. But it did work, it did come out. The mould opened pretty easily, but as you can see, there is some superficial damage, like denting, on the outside of the silicone because of how I used the screwdriver to get this out. I was a bit impatient, and so levering it up like this, I've kind of dinked the mould a bit. It doesn't seem to have a negative effect on the mould, but it would be nice if that wasn't there. Because this mould is soft, it's pretty easy for me to flex out the eyeball blank shape. I'm now ready to try and pour them up in resin. So I used Axon F40, which is a blue urethane resin. It's pretty hard when it's mixed up. If you have a regular fast cast, such as EasyFlow 120 or EasyFlow 60, that's probably better actually, because it's white. It would look more like an eyeball than this, but I don't mind the color. I like this resin. So before I pour in the resin, I should also note that I made a 3D printed sort of support cup, which sounds weird, like a wall, which can be popped onto the silicone to help keep its shape. Now, even though the silicone is holding its shape pretty good, I want to make sure that during casting, the silicone doesn't get distorted. So I made this cup thing that slots over the silicone precisely because it was made from the same CAD model as the original model was, that I made the mold in. So it's exactly the right shape, so it fits over the top. Now I spray some more of the epoxy par film release agent into the eyeball cavity, and because I don't want it to sort of collect in there, I swoosh it around with a gloved finger to get an even coating on the inside. And when I do this, I can feel the inside is a little bit gummy, which is not a good sign. It would seem that despite my efforts with this lacquer and everything, there's still some kind of inhibition on the surface of this eyeball with my silicone. So that means that the texture of the resin eyeball is going to be, a little bit textured instead of smooth, which is what I'm after. So seeing as I'm at this stage, I decide to pour it up anyway. I'm going to pour it in resin anyway and just see, exactly how it looks when it comes out. So here I mix up enough resin for the two molds, which as you can imagine is not much at all. And I pour them up solid. Now the hole at the back is wide deliberately to allow easy access for resin to be poured in, but I also wanted a short stem coming out the back of the finished eyeball. So I made these little silicone plugs. This is what these molds were that I mentioned before. These little plugs that I printed up the molds for, and I poured them up in silicone. They just pop into the back, and they fit precisely into the backs of these molds because, again, they were based on the same CAD model. This is the beauty of using CAD for this. You can get precision very easily. They fit in the back of the molds perfectly, and the hole in there is just to allow the air to escape and also to allow the excess resin to pour out. You can see when I push down on it, it kind of flexes out a little bit. So I've got some excess can escape because of that smaller hole on the back. I leave this overnight to cure, and once the resin has cured, I pop them out, and sure enough, you can see here the eyeball surface is indeed rather textured instead of smooth, which is what we would prefer. So it's a shame, but it's a good example of what silicone inhibition can mean to a project. It's not a tragedy, we could probably get by with it, but I decide to run another set of molds instead to see if I can do better. So I decided to paint a few layers of a product called Inhibit-X, which is made by a company called MANN, M-A-N-N, and it's normally sold through Smooth-On. And this is a great little product to have if you do a lot of platinum silicone work. It basically is like a super concentrated sort of dose of platinum solution, and you put a couple of layers on the mold, allow it to dry, which doesn't take long, like a minute or two, and then add your release agent over the top, and it should basically prevent inhibition, or certainly reduce it depending on how bad the inhibition is, but it typically will stop the inhibition from taking place, so your silicone that's poured over the top will cure fine on the surface. One annoying thing was that I didn't want to damage the silicone mold trying to get it out like last time either. So as well as this Inhibit-X I put on this eyeball in this one, I also wanted to try something to make it easier to get the silicone out. So I had an idea to set in 2 strips of silk fabric like this inside the printed wall on the sides, carefully using a little mix of silicone to hold them in place. This looks a little bit weird, but stay with me, it worked like a charm. The idea being that when I pour this up, I would have some handles set into the silicone which I can pull on without causing any damage to the mold itself. I decided to try a different silicone. I used a firmer silicone. It's still a platinum silicone, but it was a Shore of 24. And I left this overnight, and then in the morning I tried my handle out. I used a wooden spatula instead of a screwdriver this time. I used a wooden spatula and slid it down between the silicone and the printed mold wall to help separate them, and then carefully pulling on these handles, I was pleased to see that the mold slid out very easily without any damage to the 3D printed cup or the silicone mold or the eyeball inside. It worked like a charm. I simply snipped off the handles and cleaned up the edge of the mold with a pair of scissors afterwards, and then the silicone, being firmer this time than the previous one, meant that getting the eye form out was a little bit trickier. You can't just easily squeeze it and the eyeball pop out like it happened before. So I decided to slice the silicone down using a blade, just a little bit, not quite to the eyeball, but almost up to it. And that gave me the flex I needed to squeeze the eye form out, and the mold has worked out perfectly, as you can see. So I can then run resin in these new molds. So I spray and swoosh some release inside the cavity again, and I can feel this time that there's no tackiness, there's no gumminess to it. It's completely smooth. The silicone has cured perfectly. There's been no inhibition, so I'm very pleased. The Inhibit-X worked well. The resin again is then mixed and poured in as before, using the silicone plugs again, and then I leave this for a few hours, and once it's cured, I pop it out. The cast can be squeezed out, and we can see the cast is pretty good. The surface is smooth, but here's another thing now. We have a tiny little air bubble just there in the center hole, and it's happened on both of them, so I decide to try another set. So I'm going to use these molds again because the surface is nice. It was just an air bubble. So this time I take care with my resin to swill the resin round, and I use a little wooden mixing stick. I got like a box of coffee stirrers. I keep them in the workshop for this kind of stuff. I use that to agitate the resin where I know the bubble had occurred in the mold. I kind of prod it around a bit, and then once I've swilled it and prodded it in there, I top it up with resin and then use the plugs again, and I set it aside to set up for a few hours. Once the resin has set fully, I can pop these out and finally we have success. We have some smooth eye forms with no unwanted air bubbles, and I'm happy with these, and these can now be used for eyeball blanks in the sculpt. Thanks for watching. If you haven't already, please do subscribe to the channel and check out our podcast, Battles with Bits of Rubber, available on all the podcast platforms.